Have you ever wondered what happens when kindness gets mistaken for weakness? When years of sacrifice and support are repaid with disrespect and entitlement? Well, what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about family boundaries forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Picture this. You're sitting in your son's living room, surrounded by furniture you helped pay for, in a house your money made possible. The Christmas tree towers 12 feet high, decorated with ornaments that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. You're feeling grateful, thinking about family traditions and the holiday feast you're planning to prepare. Then, in one devastating sentence, your entire world crumbles. That's exactly what happened to Dennis Flores, a hardworking father who spent decades building a construction business and providing for his family. What he discovered that December evening would test everything he believed about love, loyalty, and what it means to be family. In this story, I'm going to walk you through one of the most shocking examples of family manipulation I've ever encountered. We'll explore how a father's generosity was weaponized against him, how years of financial support led to ultimate betrayal, and most importantly, how one man found the courage to reclaim his dignity when everything seemed lost. But first, let me set the scene so you understand just how deep this betrayal runs. Dennis had been the kind of father most people only dream of having. After his wife Maria passed away, he threw himself into supporting his son, Michael, and daughter-in-law Isabella. For 5 long years, he made their problems his problems, their dreams his financial responsibility. Every month, like clockwork, $2,800 vanished from his account into theirs. That's over $140,000 in mortgage payments alone, not counting the countless other expenses he covered without question. He refinanced his own home to provide their down payment. He maxed out credit cards for their kitchen renovation when Isabella decided granite countertops were essential for their lifestyle. He worked double shifts and ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch just to make sure their bills were paid while they lived like royalty. The silk curtains hanging in their windows? Dennis paid for those when Isabella complained about privacy. The hardwood floors they walked on every day? Those came from his second mortgage. Even the marble coffee table where they entertained guests bore the weight of his sacrifice, purchased with money that should have gone toward his own retirement. But here's what makes this story so heartbreaking. Dennis didn't just give his money. He gave his time, his energy, his dreams for the future. He postponed repairs on his own house because every spare dollar disappeared into their perfect suburban fantasy. His porch light flickered for months because he couldn't afford to fix it while subsidizing someone else's American dream. And through it all, he told himself this was what family did. This was love in action. This was a father's duty to help his children succeed. The warning signs had been building for years, though Dennis was too generous to recognize them. Isabella's expensive tastes grew more demanding with each passing month. Her designer handbags cost more than most people's rent. Her shopping sprees coincided perfectly with Dennis covering their utility bills. The professional-grade kitchen mixer that cost $2,000 sat unused after just 3 weeks, a monument to wasteful spending funded by someone else's sacrifice. But it wasn't just about money. The emotional distance had been growing too. Family photos showed Dennis's face becoming smaller and more peripheral with each passing year, as if he was slowly being erased from his own son's life. Holiday gatherings became performances where Dennis played the role of grateful grandfather, thankful for whatever scraps of attention they threw his way. Michael had changed too, shaped by years of living beyond his means with no real consequences. The confident young man who once looked up to his father had become someone who saw Dennis as nothing more than a walking ATM with inconvenient emotions attached. Isabella's influence was impossible to ignore. She came from a family that valued appearances above all else, where breeding and education mattered more than character or sacrifice. Her parents summered in the Hamptons and spoke multiple languages, credentials they wore like armor against anyone they deemed beneath their social status. And Dennis, with his working-class background and construction-calloused hands, had never quite measured up to their standards. They tolerated him when money was tight and they needed his help. But as their lifestyle improved thanks to his generosity, their tolerance turned to barely concealed contempt. The setup was perfect for what came next. Isabella's parents were visiting for Christmas, flying in from their refined world where people like Dennis simply didn't belong. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, though Dennis had no idea what was coming. He arrived that evening with his heart full of Christmas spirit, ready to share family traditions and create new memories. The house glowed with warm light, decorated with expensive ornaments and fresh garland that probably cost more than most families spent on their entire Christmas celebration. Every detail spoke of wealth and sophistication, a lifestyle made possible by one man's endless generosity. Dennis settled into the leather couch, breathing in the scent of Isabella's vanilla candles, watching the light play across his son's wedding ring. This was his family, his legacy, the reason he worked so hard and sacrificed so much. In just a few moments, all of that would be shattered by 7 simple words that would echo in his mind for months to come. The living room felt different that evening, charged with intention Dennis couldn't quite identify. Michael's posture seemed stiff, guarded, like someone bracing for impact. Isabella moved through the house with nervous energy, adjusting decorations that were already perfect, avoiding eye contact with the man whose money had made it all possible. What Dennis didn't know was that this moment had been planned. Isabella's parents had made their expectations clear during their phone calls leading up to the visit. They wanted a certain type of Christmas celebration, one that matched their refined sensibilities and social status. And Dennis, with his working-class background and unpretentious ways, simply didn't fit the image they wanted to project. The conversation that followed would expose years of hidden resentment, carefully concealed prejudice, and a level of entitlement that defied belief. But it would also reveal something else, something far more dangerous to Dennis's carefully constructed world of sacrifice and denial. He was about to discover that his generosity hadn't been appreciated or even acknowledged. It had been expected, taken for granted, and ultimately used as a weapon against him. The very people he had supported for years saw him not as a loving father and provider, but as an embarrassment to be managed and controlled. The words that Michael spoke next would cut deeper than any physical blow, striking at the very core of Dennis's identity as a father and protector. They would force him to confront a truth he had been avoiding for years, that love without respect is just expensive servitude, and that sometimes the people we sacrifice the most for are the least grateful for our efforts. But Dennis was about to learn something else too. He was about to discover that beneath his gentle exterior lay a strength he had forgotten he possessed. The same determination that had built a successful business from nothing was still there, waiting to be awakened by betrayal and disappointment. The stage was set for a reckoning that would change everything. The Christmas lights twinkling outside represented joy and family togetherness. But inside this house, a different kind of illumination was about to occur. Dennis was about to see his family clearly for the first time in years, and what he discovered would force him to make choices he never imagined he would have to make. The moment of truth was approaching, and neither Dennis nor his family was prepared for what would happen when 5 years of suppressed resentment finally exploded into the open. The silence stretched between father and son like a chasm that had been years in the making. Dennis could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Michael to explain what he meant. The Christmas tree lights cast dancing shadows across the room, creating an almost surreal atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Michael's voice came out small, defeated, like a child who knew he was about to disappoint his parent but couldn't find another way forward. He explained that Isabella's parents had very specific expectations about their Christmas celebration. They were traditional people, he said, people who valued certain customs and social dynamics that Dennis might not understand. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Dennis felt something cold settle in his chest as the implications became clear. This wasn't about traditions or customs. This was about class, about social status, about people who believed some individuals were simply more worthy of respect than others. Isabella appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the tension in the room. Her perfectly styled hair caught the light from the chandelier Dennis had helped pay for, and her designer dress probably cost more than most people spent on Christmas gifts for their entire family. She didn't speak at first, just stood there with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and defiant at the same time. Dennis looked around the room one more time, taking inventory of everything his sacrifice had made possible. The expensive artwork on the walls, the custom built-in shelving, the marble fireplace surround that had required him to work weekends for 3 months straight. Every surface, every detail, every comfort bore the invisible fingerprints of his generosity. But what struck him most wasn't the monetary value of his contributions. It was the realization that despite paying for everything in this room, he had never truly belonged here. He had been tolerated when they needed his money, welcomed when his support was required, but never actually accepted as an equal member of this family he had worked so hard to support. The conversation that followed revealed layers of prejudice and entitlement that Dennis had somehow managed to overlook for years. Isabella's parents, it seemed, had very specific ideas about appropriate dinner conversation, suitable cultural backgrounds, and the kind of people who belonged at their refined holiday gatherings. Dennis, with his working class roots and straightforward manner, simply didn't meet their standards. Michael tried to soften the blow by suggesting alternatives. Maybe Dennis could visit his sister Rosa instead, or perhaps they could arrange something for the weekend after Christmas, when the important guests would be gone and normal family dynamics could resume. The casual way he discussed reshuffling his father's holiday plans, as if Christmas were just another appointment that could be moved for convenience, revealed how little he understood about what he was asking. Dennis stood slowly, his knees protesting after years of physical labor that had funded the comfortable lifestyle his son now took for granted. The movement felt symbolic somehow, like he was rising not just from the couch, but from years of diminished expectations and grateful acceptance of whatever scraps of affection came his way. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Dennis himself. Instead of arguing or pleading or trying to negotiate a compromise, he simply smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or even a sad one. It was the smile of a man who had just received clarity about something he should have understood long ago. He walked toward the front door with measured steps, passing the family photographs where his presence had grown increasingly marginal over the years. Each frame told the story of his gradual erasure from his own son's life, a visual timeline of how financial support without mutual respect eventually leads to invisible servitude. At the door, Dennis paused and turned back to his son one final time. His voice was calm, controlled, carrying none of the hurt or anger that Michael probably expected. He wished them well with their sophisticated Christmas dinner and their educated guests, then stepped out into the December air that felt somehow cleaner than the atmosphere inside the house he had helped purchase. The drive home gave Dennis time to process what had just occurred. Street by street, he passed landmarks that held memories of the man he used to be, before he became defined primarily by his usefulness as a financial resource. The traffic light at 29th and Grand, where he used to stop and wave at other fathers loading Christmas presents for excited children. The bank on 5th Street, where he had refinanced his home to provide his son's down payment. The loan officer's warning echoed in his memory now with painful clarity. By the time Dennis reached his own driveway, something fundamental had shifted in his thinking. The cracked concrete he couldn't afford to repair, the flickering porch light he'd been putting off fixing, the outdated appliances in his kitchen all told the story of a man who had prioritized everyone else's comfort above his own basic needs. Inside his house, the silence felt different than it had in years. Not empty or lonely, but somehow clean and honest. There were no expensive decorations here, no pretentious artwork or designer furniture. Just the simple, modest home of a man who had worked hard and lived honestly, even if those qualities weren't appreciated by the people he loved most. Dennis walked to his kitchen table and pulled out the manila folder he had been avoiding for months. Bank statements, mortgage documents, automatic transfer records, 5 years of financial documentation that told the story of his generosity and their ingratitude. The numbers were staggering when he finally forced himself to add them up completely. $2,800 every month for 60 consecutive months, $168,000 in mortgage payments alone. But that was just the beginning. The down payment had been $47,000 from his home equity loan. The kitchen renovation, when Isabella decided their original countertops weren't suitable for entertaining, had cost $18,000 on his credit card. The receipts painted a picture of endless demands and willing compliance. New appliances when the old ones worked perfectly well, but didn't match Isabella's aesthetic vision. Professional landscaping because maintaining their own yard was beneath their social status. Furniture upgrades every time Isabella decided their current pieces weren't sophisticated enough for their lifestyle. Dennis sat back in his chair and looked at the final tally. Over $200,000 in 5 years. More money than he and Maria had managed to save during their entire marriage. More than his own retirement fund. More than the college education he had never been able to afford for himself. The weight of those numbers settled over him like a physical presence. This wasn't just about money, though the financial impact was devastating. This was about years of his life, decades of sacrifice, a lifetime of work reduced to automatic transfers that disappeared into someone else's dreams while his own needs went unmet. His phone buzzed with what was probably a text message from Michael, perhaps wanting to smooth over the evening's unpleasantness with empty promises and guilt-inducing manipulations. Dennis looked at the device for a long moment, then deliberately set it aside without reading the message. For the first time in years, he wasn't going to rush to make someone else feel better about treating him poorly. He wasn't going to apologize for having feelings or expectations. He wasn't going to negotiate for basic respect from people who had proven they didn't believe he deserved it. Instead, Dennis walked to his desk and pulled out his address book, the old-fashioned kind with actual paper pages and handwritten entries. He flipped through the contacts until he found what he was looking for: the customer service number for his bank, the institution that had been facilitating his financial generosity for 5 long years. The automated system offered options in English and Spanish, a small irony that wasn't lost on him given Isabella's comments about his cultural background. He pressed the appropriate numbers and waited to speak with a human being who could help him make a decision that was long overdue. When the customer service representative came on the line, Dennis explained what he needed with surprising calm. He wanted to cancel the automatic transfer that had been bleeding his account dry month after month. The representative was professional and efficient, asking for verification information and explaining the process without judgment about why a 62-year-old man might suddenly stop making payments on what was clearly his son's mortgage. The cancellation took less than 10 minutes to complete. 5 years of financial obligation, erased with a few keystrokes and confirmation codes. Dennis hung up the phone and sat in his quiet kitchen, processing what he had just done. Outside, December darkness was settling over the city. Christmas lights twinkled in windows where families gathered without conditions or prerequisites, where love wasn't contingent on social acceptability or financial contribution. For the first time in 5 years, Dennis's next monthly budget would balance. For the first time since Maria died, he could afford to fix his own house instead of subsidizing someone else's perfect lifestyle. The decision felt both momentous and surprisingly simple, like waking up from a dream that had gradually become a nightmare, or stepping out of a role that had never quite fit properly. Dennis gathered up the financial documents, the evidence of his years of martyrdom, and walked to his fireplace. The flames caught quickly, consuming bank statements and mortgage papers with hungry efficiency. 5 years of automatic transfers turned to ash in a matter of minutes. The fire felt warm on his face, warmer than he had felt in longer than he could remember. As the last of the documents disappeared into smoke and embers, Dennis poured himself a glass of the good whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive. Tonight felt special enough. He raised the glass toward Maria's photograph on the mantel, toward the memory of the woman who had always understood the difference between generosity and servitude. The whiskey tasted like freedom, and for the first time in years, Dennis felt truly at peace with his choices. What Dennis didn't realize was that his moment of liberation was just the beginning. The next morning brought a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The December sunlight streaming through his kitchen windows seemed brighter somehow, illuminating spaces that had felt dim and oppressive for far too long. As he prepared his coffee, using the good beans he'd finally allowed himself to buy, Dennis felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death: genuine contentment with his own company. His phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn, but he ignored it completely. Whatever crisis Michael and Isabella were discovering about their mortgage payment could wait. For once in 5 years, their emergency wasn't automatically his emergency to solve. Instead, Dennis spent his morning doing something revolutionary, planning for his own future. He walked through his house with fresh eyes, making a mental list of repairs and improvements he could finally afford. The flickering porch light that had embarrassed him for months, the drafty windows that made winter heating bills astronomical, the kitchen appliances that belonged in a museum. For years, he'd postponed these basic maintenance tasks because every available dollar flowed toward maintaining someone else's perfect suburban fantasy. Now, with $2,800 staying in his account each month, possibilities opened up like flowers after a long winter. The phone rang again at exactly 10:47. Isabella's name flashed on the screen like a warning signal. But this time, Dennis felt no automatic obligation to answer. He let it ring while he buttered his toast, savoring the simple pleasure of breakfast, without financial anxiety gnawing at his stomach. When the ringing stopped, Dennis found himself smiling. For the first time in their relationship, Isabella would have to wait for his attention instead of demanding it as her right. The power dynamic that had controlled his life for 5 years had shifted overnight, and the change felt intoxicating. The voicemail notification appeared within minutes, followed by another call, then another. Dennis could picture the scene unfolding across town. Isabella discovering that their mortgage payment had been declined, frantically calling the bank, learning that the automatic transfer had been canceled. The panic in her voice would be genuine now, not the manufactured urgency she used when she needed money for shopping sprees or spa treatments. By noon, his phone had recorded 8 missed calls and 3 voicemails, each one probably more desperate than the last. Dennis listened to none of them. Instead, he drove to the hardware store and spent $200 on supplies for home repairs, money that would have once gone toward their wine collection or Isabella's latest decorating whim. The clerk who helped him load the supplies into his truck was friendly and talkative, asking about his projects with genuine interest. When had Dennis last had a conversation where someone valued his expertise instead of just his wallet? The interaction reminded him of who he used to be before he became defined primarily by his financial usefulness. Back home, Dennis began work on his porch light, a simple repair that felt symbolically important. As he unscrewed the old fixture, his phone rang yet again. This time, instead of Isabella's name, he saw Michael's number, his son, finally ready to have the conversation they should have had years ago. Dennis wiped his hands on his work clothes and answered on the fourth ring, letting Michael wait just long enough to wonder if his father would pick up at all. The voice that greeted him was different from the confident man who had dismissed him from Christmas dinner. Michael sounded smaller, uncertain, like someone who had just discovered that actions have consequences. He started with apologies, stumbling over words as he tried to explain that he hadn't meant for things to go so far, that he never intended to hurt his father's feelings. But Dennis had moved beyond hurt feelings. Somewhere between canceling the mortgage payment and buying supplies for his own home repairs, he had crossed a line from wounded father to empowered individual. The conversation that followed would establish new boundaries that should have been set years earlier. Michael's explanations revealed the depth of his entitlement. He seemed genuinely surprised that Dennis had taken actual action, instead of just accepting the rejection and moving on. The automatic mortgage payments had become so routine that Michael had forgotten they represented a choice his father made every month, not an obligation he owed. The panic in Michael's voice grew more pronounced as he began to understand the financial implications. Without Dennis's monthly contribution, they couldn't make their mortgage payment. Their perfect house, with its marble countertops and silk curtains, was suddenly at risk. The lifestyle they had taken for granted was built on a foundation that had just crumbled beneath their feet. Dennis listened to his son's increasingly desperate explanations with remarkable calm. Years of suppressed resentment had crystallized into something harder and more focused. This wasn't about revenge, exactly, but it was definitely about justice, about natural consequences finally catching up to people who had avoided them for far too long. When Michael suggested they could work something out, maybe reduce the payment amount or create a formal loan agreement, Dennis almost laughed. Even in crisis, his son was negotiating, trying to maintain some version of the arrangement that had bled Dennis dry while treating him like hired help. The conversation ended with Dennis making his position crystal clear. The automatic payments were finished permanently. If Michael and Isabella wanted to keep their house, they would need to figure out how to pay for it themselves, like adults who were responsible for their own choices. After hanging up, Dennis returned to his porch light repair with renewed energy. The old fixture came free easily, revealing wiring that was still solid despite years of neglect. Sometimes, he reflected, the foundation remained strong even when the surface showed signs of wear. As he installed the new light, Dennis could hear his neighbors' children playing in their yard, their laughter carrying on the December air like music. Normal families doing normal things, without the complicated dynamics of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail that had poisoned his relationship with his son. The repair took less than an hour, but when Dennis flipped the switch and saw steady, bright light flood his front porch, the satisfaction felt disproportionate to the simple task. This was his house, maintained with his money, improved according to his priorities. For the first time in years, every dollar he spent served his own needs instead of someone else's desires. That evening, as Dennis sat in his comfortable chair reading the newspaper he could finally afford again, his phone remained blessedly quiet. The crisis across town was undoubtedly escalating, but it was no longer his crisis to solve. The emergency meetings, frantic phone calls, and desperate negotiations that were probably happening in Michael and Isabella's perfect living room were playing out without his participation. The silence felt like freedom, and Dennis was just beginning to understand how much more of his life he was about to reclaim. Isabella's call came the next morning, right on schedule. Her voice carried that familiar mixture of false sweetness and barely concealed desperation that Dennis had learned to recognize over the years. She needed a favor, she explained, something simple that would only take a few hours of his time. Her parents were arriving at the airport that afternoon, and she needed Dennis to pick them up. Their flight landed at 2 o'clock, and he was the only one available during the day to provide transportation. The request was delivered as if it were perfectly reasonable, as though nothing had changed between them despite the events of the previous few days. Dennis set down his coffee cup and listened to Isabella's explanation with growing amazement. Less than 48 hours after telling him he wasn't good enough to share Christmas dinner with her family, she expected him to serve as their personal chauffeur. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also revealing. This was how Isabella saw him, not as a family member deserving respect, but as a resource to be utilized when convenient. His feelings, his dignity, his own plans were irrelevant compared to her immediate needs. The Christmas dinner rejection hadn't been personal in her mind, just practical. Now she needed something from him, so past insults were irrelevant. When Dennis asked why she was calling him for this favor, Isabella's response stripped away any remaining pretense. "Family helps family," she said, her voice sharpening with irritation when he didn't immediately agree. "Besides," she added with casual cruelty, "he wasn't exactly busy with important things anyway." The insult hung in the air like poison gas, but instead of wounding Dennis, it clarified something important. This was how his family truly saw him, as someone with unlimited time and resources, but no legitimate needs or priorities of his own. His retirement, his hobbies, his personal interests were all secondary to their convenience. Dennis agreed to handle the airport pickup, his voice calm and accommodating. Isabella seemed relieved, probably thinking she had successfully managed another potential conflict with her difficult father-in-law. She provided the flight details and reminded him to dress appropriately as her parents noticed such things. After hanging up, Dennis sat back in his chair and smiled. Isabella had just handed him the perfect opportunity to teach a lesson about expectations and consequences. The airport pickup would happen exactly as requested, just not in the way Isabella anticipated. Instead of rushing to get ready, Dennis poured himself another cup of coffee and settled in with the crossword puzzle he had been working on. 7 across, delayed gratification, 12 letters. The answer would come to him eventually, just like everything else he had been patiently waiting for. At 2:15, Dennis was exactly where he wanted to be, in his comfortable armchair, reading the Sunday newspaper. The crossword lay completed on his coffee table, the answer to 7 across finally clear. Postponement. Sometimes the best action was strategic inaction. His phone began buzzing with increasing frequency as the afternoon progressed. Isabella's name appeared repeatedly on the screen, each call growing more urgent as she realized their airport pickup wasn't materializing. Dennis let every call go to voicemail, savoring the growing panic he could imagine building across town. By 3:30, the calls were coming from unknown numbers, probably Isabella's parents trying to reach their missing driver from the airport payphone. Dennis ignored those too, focusing instead on organizing his junk drawer, a task he had been postponing for months. Amazing what you could accomplish when you weren't constantly rushing to solve other people's manufactured emergencies. The afternoon passed peacefully, marked by the regular buzzing of his phone and the satisfaction of small household tasks finally getting attention. Dennis prepared himself a proper dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food he hadn't allowed himself in months because every grocery dollar had gone towards subsidizing someone else's gourmet lifestyle. As the winter sun set behind his backyard trees, Dennis reflected on the lesson he had just delivered. Somewhere across town, 3 people were probably standing in an airport parking lot, arguing about taxi fares and wondering how their personal servant had developed the audacity to leave them stranded. The thought made his soup taste even better, and Dennis was already looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring. The evening brought an unexpected visitor to Dennis's quiet sanctuary. The aggressive pounding on his front door shattered the peaceful silence like a sledgehammer through glass. This wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the gentle rap of a delivery person. This was the sound of fury barely contained, fists hammering against wood with the rhythm of pure rage. Dennis set down his tea and walked slowly toward the commotion, his steps measured and deliberate. Through the peephole, he could see three figures crowded on his small porch, like predators circling wounded prey. Their body language screamed confrontation, shoulders rigid with indignation, faces twisted with the kind of anger that comes from having your expectations shattered. When Dennis opened the door, he found himself face to face with Cody Jenkins, Isabella's father, his usually composed businessman's facade completely abandoned. The man's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his silver hair disheveled from what had clearly been a stressful afternoon of unexpected travel arrangements. The accusations came fast and furious, a barrage of outrage that would have intimidated most people. How dared Dennis abandon elderly people at an airport? What kind of person commits to something then simply disappears? The $40 taxi fare had apparently been the final insult in a day full of inconveniences they weren't accustomed to experiencing. Katherine Jenkins stood behind her husband, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of the afternoon's chaos. Her designer coat was wrinkled, her makeup slightly smeared, her perfectly styled hair showing the effects of stress and humidity. She looked like a woman who had just discovered that the world didn't always bend to her will. Isabella brought up the rear, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and fury. The sophisticated hostess who had planned the perfect Christmas dinner for her educated guests had been reduced to damage control, trying to explain to her parents why their personal driver had simply vanished without explanation. The verbal assault continued for several minutes, each family member taking turns expressing their outrage at Dennis's inexcusable behavior. They spoke over each other in their eagerness to communicate just how inappropriate his actions had been, how this kind of treatment was absolutely unacceptable from someone his age. Dennis listened to the tirade with remarkable calm, his expression never changing despite the volume and venom directed his way. When the initial fury finally exhausted itself, he responded with a single word that cut through their righteous indignation like a knife through silk. "Leave," he said quietly, not moving from his position by the door. The simple command stopped them mid-rant, their faces registering shock that their victim had the audacity to make demands. They had come expecting apologies, explanations, perhaps groveling from the old man who had dared to inconvenience them. Instead, they found someone who seemed completely unmoved by their displeasure. Cody recovered first, his business training kicking in as he attempted to regain control of the situation. He began listing his connections throughout the city, the important people who could make Dennis's life very difficult if he continued this pattern of disrespectful behavior. The threats were delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and social pressure. Dennis's response was a masterclass in quiet authority. Instead of defending himself or explaining his actions, he simply repeated his request that they leave his property. When they continued their verbal assault, he calmly informed them that this was his house and they were no longer welcome guests. The shift in power dynamics was subtle but unmistakable. Three people who had arrived expecting to intimidate and control suddenly found themselves on the defensive, faced with someone who refused to be managed or manipulated. Their carefully rehearsed outrage began to lose its effectiveness when met with unshakable calm. Catherine attempted a different approach, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension she had perfected over decades of looking down on people she considered beneath her social station. She spoke about Dennis's mistake, about the magnitude of his error, about the connections her husband maintained throughout their social circle. The threat was clear: cross them and face social and professional consequences. In their world of country club memberships and charity galas, reputation was everything. One word from Cody Jenkins in the right circles could destroy a man's standing in the community, make life very difficult for someone who depended on local business connections. But Dennis had moved beyond caring about their approval or their threats. The man who had once worried about fitting in with their educated friends had discovered something more valuable than social acceptance: self-respect. Their weapons of guilt and intimidation had lost their power over someone who no longer needed their validation. Isabella made one final attempt to restore her parents' authority, grabbing her father's arm and suggesting they leave this pathetic old man to his isolation. The dismissive tone she used revealed how little she understood about what had changed in Dennis's thinking. He wasn't pathetic or isolated, he was liberated. As the three visitors finally filed out of his house like a defeated army, Cody turned back at the threshold for one last threat. Dennis would regret this behavior, he promised. his voice carrying the menace of someone accustomed to having his warnings taken seriously. The consequences would be public and professional, designed to teach the old man a lesson about respecting his betters. Dennis closed the door behind them with a satisfying click, the sound of the deadbolt engaging like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Through his window, he watched them pile into their rental car, still arguing among themselves as they drove away into the December darkness. The house felt cleaner with them gone, as if their presence had left a toxic residue that was only now dissipating, but their parting words echoed in the sudden quiet, promises of public consequences and professional retaliation that might have terrified the old Dennis. This new version felt something different entirely: anticipation. If they wanted to escalate this conflict from private family drama to public warfare, they would discover that their opponent had resources and determination they had never bothered to notice. Dennis walked back to his living room and picked up his tea, still warm despite the interruption. For the first time since this whole situation began, he felt something that might have been concern, mixing with his newfound confidence. But the concern was overwhelmed by something much stronger: excitement about what came next. The battle lines had been drawn, and Dennis was no longer playing defense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to him. He settled back into his chair with his tea and a growing sense that the real conflict was just beginning. 3 days later, Dennis discovered exactly what Cody Jenkins meant by public consequences. The morning newspaper, delivered with its usual quiet thud against his front door, contained a surprise that made his coffee go cold in his hands. There, on page 3 of the local section, was his own face staring back at him in black and white. The headline read like something from a tabloid: "Local businessman abandons elderly couple during holiday storm." The photo was an old one from his company's website, probably 5 years out of date, showing a younger version of himself in a hard hat and work shirt. Below it, a story that twisted the previous afternoon's events into something unrecognizable. According to the article, Cody and Catherine Jenkins, visiting their daughter for Christmas, had been left stranded at the airport for over 4 hours when family member Dennis Flores failed to appear for a prearranged pickup. The couple, both described as being in their late 50s, had waited in frigid temperatures as a winter storm warning was issued for the region. Dennis almost laughed at the creative liberties taken with basic facts. The weather had been 52 degrees and sunny, hardly the dangerous blizzard conditions described in the piece. The winter storm warning existed only in Cody's imagination, a dramatic flourish designed to make Dennis appear callous and dangerous. The quotes were masterfully crafted to paint Dennis as an unstable old man who had suddenly snapped without provocation. Cody positioned himself and his wife as helpless victims of elder abuse, abandoned by someone they had trusted to provide basic transportation. There was no mention of the Christmas dinner rejection, no context about years of financial exploitation, no acknowledgement of the insults that had precipitated Dennis's decision. The byline belonged to Patricia Morrison, lifestyle editor, a name Dennis didn't recognize but whose involvement suggested this story hadn't appeared by accident. Someone had made phone calls, called in favors, used connections to ensure this particular narrative reached the public exactly when it would do maximum damage. Dennis read the article 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculated manipulation. This wasn't just revenge, it was character assassination carried out with professional precision. In a city the size of Spokane, reputation mattered enormously. One well-placed newspaper story could destroy decades of hard work and community standing. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By going public first, Cody had controlled the narrative, positioning himself as the victim and Dennis as the aggressor. Anyone reading this story would see an elderly couple abandoned by a family member who had clearly lost his moral compass. The damage to Dennis's reputation would be swift and potentially permanent. But as Dennis folded the newspaper and set it aside, he felt something unexpected: respect for his opponents. They weren't just entitled rich people throwing tantrums. They were strategic, calculating, and they understood exactly how power worked in small communities. The attack had been carefully planned and expertly executed. For the first time since this conflict began, Dennis realized he was facing worthy adversaries. The comfortable assumption that he was dealing with spoiled children had been shattered by evidence of sophisticated media manipulation. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of cutting off financial support and waiting for them to learn their lesson. They had declared total war, using weapons Dennis hadn't even considered. But they had also made a critical error in their strategy. They had underestimated their opponent. The same analytical mind that had built a successful construction business was now focused on a different kind of problem solving. Dennis walked to his computer and began typing names into search engines. If they wanted to play chess instead of checkers, he would show them what a real strategist looked like. The battle they had started was about to become more interesting than any of them had imagined. The research phase consumed the next 2 days, transforming Dennis from reactive victim to proactive investigator. His laptop became command central for an operation that would have impressed any private detective. Social media profiles filled multiple browser tabs like evidence files in a complex case. Cody Jenkins' digital footprint painted the picture of a man with significant local influence, but also significant vulnerability. His LinkedIn profile showed connections to half the business community, board positions with charitable organizations, and a carefully cultivated image of civic responsibility and professional success. But deeper digging revealed cracks in the facade. Professional networking sites showed subtle patterns of job changes that suggested ethical conflicts. Business registration databases revealed failed ventures and partnership disputes that had been carefully scrubbed from his public persona. Catherine's Instagram account was a masterpiece of curated privilege, every post designed to project success and sophistication. Charity luncheons at exclusive venues, wine tastings with society friends, vacation photos from European destinations tagged with gratitude for their blessed lifestyle. The comments from friends praised her elegant taste and inspiring life choices. What the post didn't show was equally revealing. No photos from their home, no glimpses of their actual living situation, no evidence of the financial foundation supporting their glamorous lifestyle. Everything suggested people living beyond their means while working desperately to maintain appearances. Isabella's Facebook timeline told the most damaging story of all. Posts about our beautiful home featured photos of the kitchen Dennis had paid for. Check-ins at expensive restaurants coincided perfectly with months when he had covered their utility bills. Status updates about hosting skills and family gatherings had been posted while actively planning to exclude him from their Christmas celebration. The digital evidence revealed a family that had documented their hypocrisy in real time, creating a perfect catalog of lies and manipulation that they had foolishly made public. Every post about their successful lifestyle was accompanied by metadata showing exactly when it was published, creating a timeline that Dennis could cross-reference with his own financial records. But it was Michael's LinkedIn activity that provided the most interesting piece of the puzzle. His recent connections included Patricia Morrison, the lifestyle editor who had written the newspaper hit piece. The connection was recent, established just days before the article appeared, suggesting coordination between the family and their media contact. A quick search through local business directories revealed 3 mutual connections between Cody and Patricia's editor at the newspaper. The story hadn't just appeared through normal journalistic channels, it had been planted deliberately using Cody's professional network to influence coverage. Dennis leaned back in his desk chair, studying the evidence spread across his screen. His opponents had made 3 critical mistakes that would prove to be their undoing. First, they had underestimated him completely, assuming he lacked the intelligence and resources to fight back effectively. Second, they had gone public with their attack, which meant he could go public with his response using the same tactics they had employed. Third, they had documented their entire lifestyle online, creating perfect evidence of their financial dependence and moral hypocrisy. The newspaper article had been their opening gambit, designed to destroy his reputation before he could mount any defense. But they had chosen the wrong target for character assassination. Dennis had spent 40 years building genuine relationships in the construction industry, earning respect through honest work and fair dealing. His reputation was built on concrete accomplishments, not social positioning. More importantly, they had given him exactly the justification he needed for what came next. By making their conflict public, they had opened the door for him to respond in kind. The evidence he was gathering would make their newspaper attack look like amateur hour when he was ready to reveal the full truth. Dennis opened a new document and began organizing his findings into a comprehensive timeline. Bank statements, social media posts, and public records began forming a narrative that would expose not just their financial manipulation, but their fundamental dishonesty about who they really were. The Christmas dinner, that was supposed to showcase their sophisticated lifestyle, would become the perfect stage for revealing the truth about how that lifestyle was actually funded. According to Isabella's Facebook events, they were expecting 12 guests, a carefully selected audience of the kind of people who read the local newspaper and formed opinions based on what they saw there. the kind of people who deserve to know exactly who they were celebrating with and whose money had made the celebration possible. Dennis closed his laptop and walked to his kitchen, where he began preparing for the most important dinner party of his life, one where he would be serving truth instead of turkey, and where the main course would be justice long overdue. The final pieces of his plan were falling into place, and Christmas Eve was going to be very different from what Isabella had imagined when she sent out those invitations. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only comes with complete moral certainty. Dennis laid out his evidence like a prosecutor preparing for the most important case of his career. Bank statements organized by year, each monthly payment highlighted in yellow marker. Receipts arranged chronologically, showing the systematic pattern of his financial support. Photos printed from their social media accounts, Isabella's jewelry collection, their vacation snapshots, the expensive Christmas decorations currently adorning the house he had helped them afford. Everything copied 12 times. One packet for each dinner guest who would be sitting at Isabella's table tonight, believing they were celebrating with successful, sophisticated hosts who had earned their comfortable lifestyle through hard work and good breeding. The newspaper article went on top of each stack, Dennis's red pen corrections visible in the margins. Lie written next to Cody's quotes about dangerous weather conditions. False beside claims about his erratic behavior. Missing context highlighted where they had failed to mention 5 years of financial support, while painting him as an unstable abandoner of elderly people. Dennis dressed with the same care he had once reserved for important business meetings. His navy blue suit, pressed to perfection, the one Maria had always said made him look distinguished. Today he would need every ounce of authority and credibility he could project, because what he was about to do would either vindicate years of mistreatment or destroy what remained of his relationship with his son forever. But that relationship had already been destroyed, hadn't it? The moment Michael chose his wife's social ambitions over his father's dignity, the moment Isabella felt comfortable insulting Maria's memory, the moment they decided Dennis wasn't good enough to share Christmas dinner with educated people, the relationship Dennis thought he was protecting no longer existed, if it ever had. By 6:30, Dennis was parked across the street from the house his money had purchased, watching the warm glow spill from windows he had helped install. Cars lined the driveway and street, luxury vehicles that spoke of the social circle Isabella had worked so hard to join. Through the front windows, he could see figures moving around the dining room, Isabella playing the perfect hostess in her element. The irony was exquisite. She was about to host the most memorable dinner party of her life, though not for the reasons she had planned. Dennis checked his watch. 6:45. Perfect timing. Late enough that everyone would be seated and comfortable, early enough that they would still be on the main course with no easy escape. He gathered his briefcase full of evidence packets and stepped out into the December evening. The front door was unlocked, exactly as he had expected. Isabella loved showing off how safe their neighborhood was, how they didn't need to worry about security like people in rougher areas. The unlocked door was another symbol of their privileged bubble, soon to be burst by reality. Dennis let himself in quietly, the warm air carrying the sounds of cultured conversation and expensive wine being poured. He could hear Catherine's voice explaining something about European art markets, probably impressing the other guests with her worldly knowledge and refined tastes. "But darling, that's not how we do things in our family," someone was saying, followed by polite laughter. Our family. After everything they had done to exclude him from it? Dennis walked into the dining room carrying his briefcase like he belonged there, which in many ways he did. 12 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to absolute horror. Isabella froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips, her perfect hostess smile melting like ice in summer heat. Michael's face drained of color so completely he looked like he might faint. Cody and Catherine sat rigid in their chairs, probably wondering if their newspaper attack had driven him to some kind of public breakdown. "Good evening, everyone," Dennis said with the calm authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I hope you don't mind me joining your Christmas celebration." Isabella found her voice first, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual controlled tone. "Dennis, this is completely inappropriate. You need to leave immediately." "Actually," Dennis replied, setting his briefcase on their marble sideboard with deliberate care, "I think your guests deserve to know who really paid for this dinner, this house, and the lifestyle you've all been admiring tonight." A woman Dennis didn't recognize, probably one of Catherine's charity friends, leaned forward with curiosity overriding social politeness. What is he talking about, Isabella? Isabella's composure cracked visibly. He's having some kind of episode. Michael, call someone. But Dennis was already moving around the table with practiced efficiency, placing a packet of documents in front of each guest like a dealer distributing cards for the most important game of their lives. Here are the bank records, he said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. 5 years of financial support. $168,000 in mortgage payments alone, plus the down payment, renovations, furniture, appliances, everything you see around you. The room went dead quiet except for the rustling of papers as 12 people began examining evidence they had never expected to see. Dennis watched their faces change as they absorbed the numbers, the dates, the undeniable proof of his generosity and their host's deception. This is, one man started, then stopped, staring at a bank statement showing automatic transfers that had been bleeding Dennis dry for years. Outrageous, finished the woman across from him, her voice filled with disgust. Isabella, why didn't you tell us any of this? Isabella's perfect composure was disintegrating in real time. It's more complicated than it looks. Dennis volunteered to help us. We never asked for this. Actually, Dennis interrupted, pulling out copies of the newspaper article. Let's talk about what you did ask for and what you told the media about me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Dennis placed copies of the character assassination piece on the table. He watched the dinner guests recognize his photograph from the unflattering story that had run just 3 days earlier, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to outrage. Now, Dennis said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, let's discuss the real manipulators in this family. Cody's face had gone from its usual confident red to an ashen gray that made him look every one of his 60-plus years. Catherine sat frozen in her chair, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, probably calculating how much social damage was being done with every passing second. Mr. Jenkins here used his banking connections to plant this story, Dennis continued, tapping the newspaper article with one finger. Notice how I'm portrayed as unstable and dangerous, abandoning poor elderly people in freezing weather conditions. A distinguished gray-haired man in an expensive sweater looked up from the article with confusion and growing anger. Cody, what is this about? This doesn't sound like the man who's been supporting your daughter's family. The weather was 52 degrees and sunny, Dennis said before Cody could formulate a response. And they weren't stranded tourists. They were Isabella's parents, coming to the Christmas dinner I had been banned from attending because I wasn't good enough for their educated company. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. That's not... You never said what, Catherine? Dennis pulled out his phone, where he had screenshot several of Isabella's social media posts. That I was too low class for your parents? That my Mexican food and working-class conversation would embarrass you in front of your sophisticated friends? The woman Dennis had identified as one of Catherine's charity circle shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Catherine, surely you didn't actually... He's twisting everything, Cody blustered, but his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. This man has serious mental health issues, the stress of aging, financial problems. Financial problems? Dennis almost laughed. Mr. Jenkins, I've been supporting your daughter and son-in-law to the tune of nearly $3,000 a month for 5 years. The only financial problems here are the ones you're about to face. He turned to address the entire table, making eye contact with each guest in turn. These people have taken over $200,000 from me while calling me names behind my back. They've manipulated my son against me, banned me from family gatherings, and when I finally stood up for myself, they tried to destroy my reputation in the newspaper. Michael spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I didn't know about the newspaper. Your wife knew, Dennis said quietly but firmly, and her parents orchestrated it. They turned me into a villain for refusing to be their personal ATM and chauffeur service. The social dynamics in the room were shifting like tectonic plates. Dennis could see it in the guests' faces. The gradual realization that everything they had been told about their generous hosts was built on lies and financial manipulation. This is unconscionable, said an elderly woman wearing pearls, staring at the bank statements with obvious revulsion. Cody, how could you let your daughter take advantage of this man's generosity, then attack him publicly when he stopped enabling your lifestyle? Cody's carefully maintained facade was crumbling like a house built on sand. You don't understand the full situation. I understand perfectly, the woman interrupted, her voice sharp with moral authority. This man has been supporting your family financially while you treated him like hired help. And when he finally said no, you tried to ruin his reputation with lies. Catherine's voice came out strangled with desperation. He abandoned us at the airport? After you told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner because my presence would be inappropriate for your parents, Dennis said calmly, meeting her eyes without flinching. After 5 years of paying your bills while you looked down on me for my ethnicity and education level. The silence was deafening. 12 people staring at Cody and Catherine with expressions ranging from disgust to embarrassment for having associated with them. The carefully constructed social facade they had spent years building was collapsing in real time. Isabella made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative. Everyone, please. This is a family matter that's gotten out of hand. No, Dennis said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. This stopped being a family matter when you made it public, when you used the newspaper to attack my character, when you decided my reputation was acceptable collateral damage for your pride. He looked around the table at faces he didn't recognize but who now knew exactly who he was and what he had endured. I wanted you all to know the truth before you read about Dennis Flores in the paper again, because you will read about me again, but next time it'll be the real story. Dennis closed his briefcase and straightened his tie with the satisfaction of a job well done. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. It's the last one I'll be paying for. As he walked toward the door, he could hear the eruption beginning behind him. Voices raised in accusation, questions demanding answers, the sound of a carefully constructed social facade falling apart like a house of cards in a strong wind. It was the most beautiful Christmas music Dennis had ever heard. The cold December air felt clean and honest against his face as he walked to his truck. Behind him, through the windows of the house his money had helped buy, he could see the dinner party dissolving into chaos. Some guests were already standing, gathering their coats, clearly wanting no part of the social disaster unfolding around Isabella's dining table. Dennis drove home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, past houses where families gathered without conditions or prerequisites, where love wasn't contingent on social acceptability or financial contribution. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. The battle was over, and justice had been served exactly as it should be. Publicly, completely, and with the same precision his opponents had used when they tried to destroy him. They had taught him the rules of their game, and he had simply played it better than they ever imagined possible. At home, Dennis poured himself a glass of the good whiskey and settled into his comfortable chair. Tomorrow would bring consequences, phone calls, probably desperate attempts at damage control from people who had just discovered what happened when you underestimated someone who had nothing left to lose. But tonight belonged to him. Tonight was victory, earned through patience, strategy, and the kind of quiet strength that had built his business and would rebuild his life. The Christmas lights twinkling outside his window looked brighter somehow, full of promise for a future where respect was earned, not demanded, and where family meant something more than financial convenience. Dennis raised his glass toward Maria's photograph and smiled. Justice served, dignity restored, and a new chapter beginning exactly when he was ready to write it.